So welcome to Gregor Tratnik's final thesis presentation. His topic is the etymology of craft. Today we are joined as our external critic, we have Catherine Rossi from the University of Kingston in London. Welcome, Catherine. Of course, I want to say that this is highly unusual for us. Normally everything works very smoothly and we've managed to adapt quite well to this virtual environment, but this morning it just isn't to be. So just a quick introduction of Catherine, because probably seeing as she's in the UK, we haven't crossed paths with her in our reviews before. Catherine Rossi is Associate Professor in Design History at Kingston University in London, where she is Director of Research in the School of Critical Studies and Creative Industries. Her PhD, Modern Craft, History, Theory and Practice, received a collaborative doctoral award from the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK. She developed her doctoral dissertation into the publication Crafting Design in Italy, from Post-War to Postmodernism. Dr. Rossi is currently working on co-editing Post-Craft, an exploration of contemporary craft. So welcome, Catherine, and thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. And of course, I've never experienced a day which doesn't have or hasn't had a tech problem. So it would be unusual if it didn't go wrong somehow.
Yeah, we've been lucky, I guess. Greg's committee for the thesis consists of Carlo Parente as his supervisor, Garth Norbroughton as a second reader, and I am serving as his program rep. So Greg, you know how this works. I'm sure you've been through a few of these. So you have approximately 20 minutes to present. As you have a pre-recorded video, I won't be giving you any time warnings because it will just run as it needs to. After that, we will open the floor for questions of clarification, followed by general discussion of the thesis. Once that has come to an end, we will ask you to leave the meeting so that the committee can deliberate privately. And then Carlo will be in touch with you regarding our discussion. Okay, just before we get started, I see Jennifer has joined us. Jennifer, so sorry for the technical mess this morning. This is highly unusual for us. It's unfortunately, it's set us back in terms of timing. I'll just make a quick introduction. I've already introduced our other panelists. So just very quickly, Jennifer Esposito is an architect with Super Cool here in Toronto and adjunct faculty member at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture. She completed her professional Master of Architecture at Carleton University and holds a post-professional Master of Architecture from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. She has taught at Dalhousie, and prior to joining Super Cool, she was an associate at McKay Lyons Sweet Apple Architects in Halifax. Welcome, Jennifer, and thanks for joining us. I'm assuming you can hear us okay. Great, okay. Okay, so Greg, whenever you're ready, we can start.
Okay, Marco, just to touch on earlier, I am doing the presentation live.
Oh, you are? Apologies.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully, I won't need too many prompts to make sure I stay on time. But yeah, so I'll begin. The etymology of craft. There exists a fundamental separation between architecture and construction, as hierarchies of knowledge place mind over body and design over workmanship. This thesis attempts to mend these cultural mischaracterizations by understanding the etymology of knowledge, industry, and craft through definitions of tool, maker, and material, to demonstrate craft as the plane on which architecture and construction can be brought together harmoniously. This is then applied to the context of Toronto, at first through brick materiality and construction, and later the fire station archetype, tracing the dialogical consequences imparted upon building cultures through the unique practices of ontological construction techniques examined via poetic construction of the joint to produce a discourse of craft knowledge based in design and workmanship synchronously. By mining the rich traditions of craft, a renewed understanding of architecture is yielded, where workmanship and design become extensions of one another, achieving a rich diversity through the act of making and reinstilling diverse regional character. The story endures as the preservation and transfer of knowledge. Like the story, craft exists as a tool for the perpetuation of cultures as manifested in the architectural object. Both narrative and craft tradition exist as carriers of knowledge, though where stories are limited to explicit knowledge, craft captures both explicit and tacit knowledge as they coalesce into a single artifact. The hymn to Hephaestus characterized craftspeople as poets, as did Plato, for they fulfilled the highest human potential, with both practice and theory derived from poetry. Aristotle would later claim the highest human capacity existed in knowledge about knowledge, establishing a hierarchy that diminished concern for manual skill in favor of intellectual. Architecture was born of craft, conceived in the tracing house of the master mason of Gothic cathedrals, yet their disparity grew ever more distinct, first culminating in the Renaissance with architecture designated a profession and craft an occupation. Contemporary architectural practice prioritizes intellectual skill, a conceptually perfect abstraction known as design, where the architectural object is physically impossible to achieve, existing indefinitely. The manual skill that defines the workmanship necessary for construction is seen as beneath design. Craft challenges this in a balance of design and workmanship. The Industrial Revolution brought Taylorism and Fordism, philosophies characterized by the distinction of design and workmanship, placing significance entirely in design processes. These philosophies prioritized a worker's efficiency as opposed to his skill, devaluing craft knowledge and later becoming the handmaiden of modernism in architectural discourse. In response, the work of John Ruskin and later William Morris propagated a handmade ideal mired with romantic nostalgia for traditional forms of making throughout the arts and crafts movement, culminating in a cultural misunderstanding limiting craft to workmanship. Craft had become an attitude of protest, independence, and snobbery, propagating paranoia over knowledge. The downfall of craft was made easy by architecture, blaming shifts in materials, processes, and scale. However, the developmental phases of modernism like the Bauhaus prove the argument is more nuanced, evident in Mies's demonstration of material, tectonic, and construction knowledge through his steel connection details. The degree of distinction between design and workmanship demonstrates the providence of craft over time. Entirely detached by modernism, design and workmanship would converge once again through an exchange of knowledge between object and maker. Ending design as a one-way system, the core principles of craft, tool, maker, and material are redefined. Labor is composed of the necessities of life, with work being everything beyond that. All things are embedded with useless work, a manifestation of craft knowledge. Craft and handmade exist synonymously within cultural vernacular, limiting characterizations of craft tools. Handmade is not a technical term, rather a cultural one, attempting to define a language of technology through a word not inherently technical. Craft, therefore, becomes a gatekeeper for specific ideals of work defined by hand tools. Frank Lloyd Wright contested this, declaring the architect can either adapt to the machine or become irrelevant. Wright's vision of architecture characterized the machine as tool, an engine of emancipation and enslavement, a helpless monster without mankind's guidance. Whether the monster becomes murderer, servant, or savior is for the architect to decide. The humanization of these machines through systems of feedback and digital tools propagate a reemergence of small workshop dynamics through the democratization of tools. Cultivating this power across many small workshops restores cultural narratives derived in craft, defining the machine as tool and therefore savior. The workshop of one of history's greatest Luthers, Antonio Stradivari, illustrates the knowledge transmission of the master-apprentice relationship, a structure fundamental to the development of the craftsman, spawning the growth and expertise of Cremonese Luther communities. Similar lessons are found in contemporary work, as opposing program production models characterized as the cathedral and the bazaar illustrate craft as a communal format, where the cathedral illustrates the closed source programming of corporate structures, and the bazaar the open source domain of public software. Within architecture, Carlos Scarpa believed the elementary rule for a job well done was to place oneself in the hands of the maker. Within contemporary architectural praxis, the craftsman cannot be characterized by a single individual. Instead, the collaborative efforts of individuals amalgamating workmanship and design knowledge through craft. Case design similarly flattens the design builder hierarchy of Afsara Academy, allowing collaborators greater freedom and contribution to the design through a loosened architectural grip, bringing together thoughtful participants willing to engage in the act of making collaboratively. Philosophies surrounding truth in construction aim to express the logic that goes directly from means to buildings. The transformation of matter into materials is the very first creative gesture and the origin of construction and architecture. Material is invented by the maker as a synthesis between the matter that constitutes it and the culture that gives its construction meaning. This thesis studies the concept of material through brick masonry construction. Two debates surround brick, the first being mass as a product of manual work, characterized as solid masonry. It makes no aesthetic claim other than to give primacy to the resultant form by way of honest load-bearing masonry construction. In contrast, veneer masonry constitutes the idea of surface as a medium for meaning, where the wall as boundary takes precedent. The resulting surface is a reversal of the former cause and effect narrative, in that it is the appearance of brick masonry that determines its assembly technique. Initial research began with an investigation of brick material and veneer construction. The study used 2 brick sizes, both in American modular format with ratios of 2 and 3 to 1, to construct a complex masonry bond turning a corner. A raked zigzag brick pattern was developed through its own construction, where the black modular brick ties the veneers together, providing legible assembly through tectonic necessity. A study of the brick following its construction determined the additional size beyond the standard afforded greater tectonic capability, affirming the effectiveness of modular brick formats beyond a single standard unit. The unique application of bespoke masonry units was then identified in 9 distinct projects, studying construction narratives from the scale of the brick unit through the detail to the construction of the building itself. This approach relies on small brickworks using traditional hand-pressed methods, expanding craft definitions to include the making of the individual brick, as well as masonry construction. Shapes were replicated in hardwood, investigating how they fit in the hand of the mason, determining the extent to which the material lends itself to workmanship, and where boundaries could be pushed beyond standard formats. This research would form the basis for a bespoke modular brick system, characterized by a brick square in profile, combining stretcher and shiner, soldier and sailor, header and row lock, measuring 75 millimeters in width and height and 500 millimeters in length, the length of exactly 6 headers plus head joints. The module established a grid framework for the system, from which brick could be cut to length and shapes invented. Imagined as an open source format where the invention of bespoke shapes by various architects would expand the system's capability, inevitably, as shapes new and old could be used in the development of complex brick details. Attempts were made to mass produce the brick for the purposes of tectonic investigation. Hardwood replicas were cast in silicone, generating a mold used in the production of plaster bricks. However, the substitution of clay with plaster presented numerous bonding issues that halted investigations. This revealed a fundamental issue beyond the technical, as the brick lacked a context to extract craft knowledge from. Therefore, the logical evolution was to better understand that context, that being brick masonry construction cultures in the city of Toronto. 19th and 20th century construction practices in Toronto can largely be defined by the city's 2 great fires, forcing more stringent building codes with mandatory fire-resistant masonry construction for all new buildings, bringing forth an industrial brick-making boom that would characterize the city's construction culture for the next century, situating brickyards close to the city and quarrying clay from local pits. The brick-making industry was a local effort in the development of the city and its sense of place, resulting in the Ontario-sized brick, a format unique to Toronto and the surrounding area. In parallel, firefighting became a critical city service. The Toronto Fire Department was thrust into a heroic spotlight, their station architecture a reflection of that. These fire halls were more than just infrastructure conceived of ontological roots. They grew a cultural significance beyond the technical through the poetics of craft construction, becoming a celebration of the communities they protected and their new paradigm of safety. The first to be constructed was after the fires was Kew Beach Fire Hall in 1905, built from red brick with hand-carved stone facings and a timber frame roof, tectonic bearing on stereotomic construction. Their interface creating a joint expressing a fundamental syntax, whereby one culture of construction is disparate from another. Comprehension of this syntax provides a narrative to study, one told by craft unique to the locale. The Toronto Fire Station provides the story, read through a taxonomy diagramming the archetype. Kew Beach was dissected into dialogical and ontological parts via massing and tectonic diagram. From there, 5 additional stations built before and after the Great Fires derived the tower-house relationship that illustrates the iconic structure. Pragmatically, the tower is used for drying hoses. However, it bears an extroverted relationship with the community as cultural landmark. Construction culture was investigated through a model made of materials appropriate to stereotomic and tectonic construction. These construction practices resulted in highly expressive joints between the brick masonry wall and wooden roof structure as the assemblies reach beyond one another, resulting in narrative logics that contradict tectonic and stereotomic dialogues. Specifically, the vertical masonry wall takes precedent over the horizontal ridge at the gable, yet holds for the downward slope of the rafters. The ontological necessity of these details creates a juxtaposition of construction hierarchies that results in a poetic tension at the joint. The established research structure was then expanded upon, characterizing 2 additional periods, functional and civic. Now fading memory of the Great Fires contributed to a shift in significance for the Toronto Fire Department. Modernism saw the iconic station obscured by a prioritization of function, categorizing it as infrastructure, most evident in the treatment of the hose tower, existing now for the singular purpose of drying. Construction of this era was sympathetic to modernism, evident through the tectonic concrete frame with stereotomic brick masonry infill. Brick masonry no longer bore, it filled tectonic frames, recognizing a functional approach to construction. The primacy given to the functional joint blurred cultural syntax and left it mired in confusion between definitions of ontological and representational. The model, a reflection of this, read both ways as either concrete or brick pilaster, the answer to which is deliberately ambiguous. As civic structure, the station struggles to identify itself against the fabric of the city. The tower now a manufactured scenography, becoming almost satirical as it is referenced in the massing, yet the tower itself relegated to the rear and ignored. This alludes to a suppression of poetic construction, its civic nature placing it on a pedestal as a precedent of performance, limiting evaluations of construction to quantifiable measurements, supporting a notion of construction separate from design. Prioritizations of building performance create a joint poetically suppressed, a product of material systems mass-produced by a catalog of components that homogenizes the architectural landscape and removes craft syntaxes from cultural dialogues. The treatment of brick is largely displaced from traditional solid masonry construction. The skin split from structure, figuratively in constructional concept, yet literally in the final model. This simple act of splitting a single sheet of stone with hammer and chisel insinuates a poetic expression of the joint within composite assemblies. The courtyard assembly of the Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery illustrates an exploited layered motif in the interfacing of subordinate elements to totemic elements, where the composite nature of the building is made explicit, thus poetic. The superimposition of Semper's 4 elements of architecture provide a framework for assignments of construction hierarchies, as well as a redefinition of brick masonry from earthwork to textile. The framework was applied to the initial design scheme of the hose tower to develop a legible tectonic assembly through poetic expressions of the joint. The structure, however, fails to identify as hose tower, being scenographic, forcing architectural discourse to consider the possibility of an excess of conspicuous tectonic craft. The response to this being one of context, where an increasingly homogeneous setting places greater responsibility on the architectural object to compensate. Relevant now is the City of Toronto proposes the co-location of stations within private structures. In other words, the fire station as a community-defining standalone archetype will now become secondary program beneath the fabric of the homogeneous monotony of condominium towers. The design of the station largely follows Scarpa's treatment of the joint condominium of the type of connection, articulation, or bearing element. It is a junction capturing the whole in the part, extending to spatial ideas of linkage like stairs or bridges. In Scarpa's philosophy, everything turns on the joint, to the extent the joint becomes the generator as opposed to the plant, giving primacy to tectonic craft. The joint is established via pragmatic processes of hose drying, expressed poetically through the construction of the building. Hoses are drawn and hung within a brick masonry shell that functions as both void and building structure, dripping water down into a concrete base. Ridges cast into the concrete direct water down its sloped, then vertical face, only to drip into a drainage trough below. The establishment of this detail defines the joint, and consequently, material and tectonic frameworks derived from the function of the hose tower. The building narrative was then established as a single vehicle station developed under a P3 structure that saw the house integrated into a tower development with the apparatus bay and tower structure attached in parasitic nature, maintaining a presence in the community. The ground floor makes immediate the unique interpretation of the tower-house relationship, where the definition of towers expanded to serve as building circulation, flanked by the hose tower structures with hose storage compartments nestled in between. On the second floor within the lounge space resides a fireplace, its purpose largely metaphoric, alluding to the brick firing kilns that produce the building's characteristic material, serving as contrast to established water motifs and totem to the firefighters that reside in the fire station. The fire pole, visible on all 3 plans, yet functional between second and ground floors, travels the entire vertical run of the stairs from ground to service deck. The stair and pole comprise a single architectural element, every tread structurally reliant on the pole assembly, serving as joint connecting all 3 planes of vertical space. These programmatic elements and others like them are considered avenues of tectonic craft translating across building scales as a series of joints around which the building is designed and constructed, largely informed by their purpose. Their function is also informed by their construction. Expression of programmatic joints becomes legible on the exterior, as the nature of the brick masonry veneer derives not from voids carved out of solid mass, but the forms of concrete structure beneath it, akin to skin over muscle. The curves of the tower billow the brick veneer, protruding through the roof of the building and rising skyward, yet remain reliably anchored to the ground through 8 masonry buttress walls. The buttresses and towers form the front structure, spanned by a butterfly roof supported on the front side of the building by cantilevered steel beams anchored to the buttresses. The remaining roof structure is supported by columns pocketed into the composite masonry wall on the backside of the building. This hierarchy communicates the building's functional significance towards the front of the structure through an asymmetric balance of its physical and visual weight. The visual weight drawn largely to the hose tower, constructed as a concrete tube clad in brick veneer on both sides, its complex form generating a place upon which a series of building elements collide in an array of joining interfaces. Although the building's construction appears to be complex, it maintains a familiar approach to wall assembly, utilizing complex load-bearing masonry wall structures to maintain continuous insulating and membrane layers around the building envelope. The suppression of the joint based on building performance is challenged here, as the complex joints maintain accepted practices while simultaneously making poetic layered assemblies. All building proportions are derived from the specified brick module. The brick sets the concrete core of the tower, and the tower dictates buttress spacing, establishing a structural rhythm that responds to the tower by skipping every third truss. Thus, the construction process speaks to design and design to construction. The truss itself is a composite of wood and steel, steel in service of tension loads and wood for rigidity, allowing for deliberate and controlled placement of wood relative to masonry. The station maintains a strict hierarchy where composite masonry constitutes stereotomic structure and wood tectonic. However, wood cannot bear on masonry. Therefore, steel becomes a transitional material, providing articulation between the timber column and masonry wall through a steel footing anchored to the concrete structure and surrounded by brick veneer. The joint is not limited to ontological construction, as construction principles can be used to communicate abstract, nuanced ideas about the building's purpose or who it is in service to. This is fundamentally the act of making and what transforms construction from a mere assembly of parts into a poetic expression of craft. The building is littered with moments described as such, from the tower crown as an articulation of both cavity wall ventilation and the separation of brick veneer from the timber roof to the assembly of the apparatus bay as a whole. The bay and its doors connect the fire station to the neighborhood it serves. The doors and canopy take advantage of the 10-degree rake established by the buttresses to communicate the explosive nature with which the truck departs to an emergency, blaring its horns and sirens, expressed even in the expansion joints of the concrete driving surface that articulate forward motion. Here we come full circle, where hoses hoisted to the top of the tower drain to the bottom into the floor drain to be carried off to a communal collection pool next to the tower. The motif of hanging hoses is repeated in the downpipe hanging off the cantilevered gutter of the butterfly roof, immediately calling attention to the tower's purpose. It contacts the building over 5 instances through 4 unique means, culminating at a well next to the station entrance as a call to what exists beyond the threshold. The assembly is repeated once more in the construction of the apparatus bay draining canopy, this instance albeit more nuanced than the former. It could even be argued the fire pole construction evokes this motif, the steel structure notched into the top of the concrete core, suspending the pole within the void. There were stronger argument surrounds the bespoke brick masonry units, providing a continuous notched surface for the notched course for the installation and adjustment of open riser steel stair treads circling the pole structure. Brick masonry itself becomes a tool of articulation, defining the insulated surfaces of buttress walls at both ends of the tower. The bonding is designed to extend the brick veneer beyond the turn of the corner, creating an edge past the surface of the brick below and continuing downward as if to sever the wall. This is further articulated through color differentiation, extracted from historical Toronto masonry cultures, as construction was once largely defined by 2 colors, produced by brickmakers from the surrounding clay, that would come to define the city for a century. Traditional red clay is used as primary cladding for the building. Yellow buff is used strategically to further articulate the distinction of wall assemblies, as well as indicate the extent of said assembly beyond the visibility of the edge detail. At its core, this building is an exercise in poetic expression of single-width veneer masonry within frameworks of contemporary construction, investigated through a series of elevations, delicately outlining the specific bonding patterns of buttress walls and surfaces between. The system uses the modular format established previously, expanded upon through a series of shapes to resolve the interfacing of curved and angled walls. Although design is a direct result of construction, therefore, regardless of the format, the module dictates the dimension, with bespoke shapes created to expand the capability of the system. The buttress walls require the design of 4 complete patterns, one side joining a perpendicular wall, the other a tower assembly. The spans between them filled with equally specific bonding patterns for the tower and perpendicular wall, as well as opposing assemblies to accommodate asymmetry of both the bond and structural grid. While the hypermodular nature of the brick is meant to expand system capabilities within an established framework, the 10-degree slope cannot be accommodated, and a certain number of bricks must be cut to size on the site by the mason during the wall's construction. Craft cannot require the architect to deduce every unique instance of brick needed to assemble the wall beforehand, illustrating the necessity for the architect to ultimately place their work in the hands of those building it. The sheer complexity of building construction today makes nostalgic the ideal of the all-knowing individual craftsman impossible. Craft instead should be viewed as a collaborative exercise requiring an amalgamation of diverse knowledge sets from a group of thoughtful participants willing to engage in the act of making. The result is a collaborative process where every maker is inspired and informed by the work of others' contributions, leading to a harmony between ideas and physical manifestation. Craft, therefore, is only possible in if the destructive hierarchies placing intellectual skill over manual, design over workmanship, and architect over builder are flattened. Architecture is the fundamental act of construction, where a craft tectonic is not just the activity of materially requisite construction, but one that raises construction to an art form, yielding a condensation of the entire structure in a single component. The assembly is therefore poetic, a language of making legible in the building's construction from which a cultural syntax is derived that speaks to the purpose of the architectural object, the place within which it exists, and the culture from which it is constructed. A new knowledge established with its construction built on the knowledge that came before it, and hopefully foundation for knowledge to come. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Okay, so with that, what we normally do at this time is we invite any questions for clarification rather than the kind of commentary on the work. If there are any questions for clarification, first I'll invite our guests, Catherine and Jennifer, if you have any such questions. Catherine, can you turn your muting off, please? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Gregor. That was a really interesting and polished presentation. I have one question that I think is maybe it's a combination of clarification and something to go into, which is your diagram, if that's the right word, of your etymology of craft that I was looking at in both the PDF of the thesis that was sent through, but also you very fleetingly and tantalizingly showed on screen. Partly it's the impossibility of reading on screen. I wondered if you could just talk us a bit through exactly what it is that it's bringing together, like what the data is and also what it is that it's saying.
I assume you're talking about the diagram with the curves kind of separating and coming back together.
That's the one, yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I just want to kind of get to it. So the diagram itself is kind of meant to take what kind of fundamentally defines the first half of the thesis. And that's the narrative of craft, being defined by design and workmanship together as like a harmonious idea. So Plato kind of specifically sets out the notion that craft is the highest form of human capacity, and that craft is defined by the design and workmanship coming together. And what I wanted to illustrate is how that notion, the separation of design and workmanship, kind of separated through a series of sort of abstract events that I listed on this diagram, and how that kind of escalated towards the Industrial Revolution, and where in my thesis I argue it peaks around the end of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the Information Age, where sort of evolving technologies that spawn digital tools and systems of feedback that allow us to relate closer to these industrial machines, arguably sort of reinvigorated a craft context within which we work. So that coming together of the diagrams is kind of meant to illustrate that through sort of like philosophies of mass customization, tools of like CNC, laser cutting, and the democratization of such tools, and the establishment of the workshop dynamic again, we're returning to some form of idealized craft of the past. Granted, the important thing to note is that the diagram never actually comes together, because I speculate that we're not at that point yet, and in fact that If I were to continue this diagram, I would speculate that those two lines coming together would exist differently, and that notion kind of forms the conclusion of my thesis, is that this idea of craft as an individual doesn't exist anymore and isn't possible given the complexity with which we build today, but rather craft is a sort of encompassing a more collaborative group effort. Other parts of my thesis deliberately reject the definition of the craftsman as sort of a gatekeeping tool, and rather accept the term maker to describe the players within craft, and craft as sort of an umbrella term that describes the collaborative.
Thank you. That does help clarify it for me.
Jennifer, do you have any questions?
Sorry. Actually, I mean, I had a similar clarification question about this diagram. And just a follow-up question to this, if we're ready for that part of it.
Sure, I think we can get into the discussion now, if you like.
Yeah, because it relates to this diagram. So I was thinking a little bit about what you said, and you've helped to spark this conversation more by what your answer. But you know, as we sit here, you know, in this current time, like on a Zoom thesis, like we all can't like help but wonder about the future of work and the future of architectural practice specifically. And to me, and you talk about this, like, you know, the idea of craft traditionally has so much to do with the hand, or, you know, cultural knowledge passed on from generation to generation. And the building kind of exists as an archive of that knowledge. As you just said, you know, the passing of that knowledge relates to communication and storytelling. You know, something in my mind that is a kind of embodied experience and requires physical presence. You know, and you talked a little bit about, you know, current trends in robotics, and you know, we were already living in a global world where, you know, you could work in Europe and have a project, you know, manage a project in North America. But I can't help but wonder about the effect of the pandemic and the effect that it's going to have on architecture, and in this case, you know, the idea of craft and that kind of one-on-one relationship. You know, people are already talking about how things won't go fully back to normal, and that you'll be working, or the idea is to work more and more remotely as architects to create a kind of better work-life balance. And that, to me, takes us further and further away from the, you know, master architect apprenticeship model. And you talked about the workshops at kind of Violin Maker Studio, and, you know, many practices that I know of are talking about potentially even shutting down the studio, or working, you know, less and less in the studio and less in a collaborative way, and maybe only visiting the site, you know, as required by the contract. So I'm kind of wondering, after saying all that, if you could speculate a little bit more about, you know, the future of craft in a kind of post-pandemic world, given that we're going to be more and more isolated potentially.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'll preface this with, like, I guess, like, the entire, I mean, definitely the pandemic kind of throws a wrench into the logic. And by the time the pandemic kind of came around and those questions came up, much of like the conceptual research was kind of like established. But you're right, it does kind of force these questions that kind of allude to more traditional sort of craft structures, the kind of intimate relationship of the master and apprentice, and these sort of collaborative spaces to evolve. But I think like through these sort of evolving technologies, specifically, that definition can kind of change. And kind of the example that immediately comes to mind is the idea that like the idea of drawing, architectural drawings now can kind of be interpreted differently. Like the 3D model that's produced isn't necessarily just a representational thing. It can be the actual, it is the actual thing, whether that thing is 3D printed or CNC'd. So the idea that like you send a drawing to, let's say, like specify a certain detail, send a drawing to a machine shop, and it's their job to review or produce that, or a client to see those things, is like you're sending a representation. Whereas with digital tools, computational technologies, you are physically sending that thing. You are sending a 3D object that is then interpreted by a 3D printer and produced. So in that sense, I think it kind of begins to insinuate a sort of larger kind of a global kind of context that's brought together, that's brought much more closely. And so I think it's those tools where these sort of ideas of collaboration and communal sort of systems start to be expanded and are maintained even in a context like the pandemic where we're all sort of locked at home. Granted, it's like we're as I mentioned, it's like these tools are still more democratized, and it's like if you look at the kind of tools we have access to versus comparing those like distinctions 150 years ago, it's like we've come a long way. But the idea that like everyone has a CNC or everyone has a 3D printer is still short. And I think kind of like what I'm alluding to, I'm immediately reminded of an example of I follow a variety of just makers on YouTube and Instagram, and this one in particular developed a sort of like wooden camera jig that could be cut from CNC or laser cut parts. And what that immediately spawned was just the whole community, taking those files and cutting out their own versions and manipulating and updating that object and developing it in sort of like in an open source kind of craft format that I allude to in my thesis.
Catherine, would you like to come in again to the conversation?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess picking up on that and in a way staying with the diagram is that one of the other ways of reading the diagram is that when those lines do get closer is when we're in moments of what are variously called craft revivals. And I was thinking about the context of how you describe the context of your thesis in the thesis and also in your presentation. And I really liked how you talked about your own background in terms of your kind of hands-on understanding of materiality. But I didn't see so much, and maybe I'm wrong here, the idea, this kind of articulation pre-pandemic, let's say, of this broader kind of revival of interest in brick on the one hand, but also craft culture more generally. And I wondered maybe if you could just talk a little bit more about that, and also maybe why is a return of interest in brick to do with the craft revival? Like, what is the synergy between those two things?
Yeah. So I don't know. I didn't mention it in this thesis, but like my background, like I grew up, my dad's a mason. I grew up working for him, and that's where my interest in sort of brick masonry comes from, and that's what spawned the decision to investigate the material here. But I think also just I think it was also the fact that it's a material rich with tradition, rich with meaning, especially in places like Toronto, Chicago, New York, the surrounding area, that has experienced an evolution and is seen extremely different today as like a veneer construction material versus like load-bearing masonry. And a lot of the argument discussion you hear is that, at least I heard, like working these sites too, was that the brick veneer is kind of like reduced to this kind of cheaper building material. It's a shell of what it once was, and that that its kind of construction and use exists primarily or kind of continues to exist on the basis of like of some sort of cultural heritage and romanticization. So I wanted to kind of, in an effort where I'm to some degree dispelling romanticizations of craft, I also wanted to continue that into brick masonry and sort of try and evolve a language where these layered cavity wall systems, like it began with a pure material exploration of brick, but then expanded into brick's influence on the construction of on assemblies and construction that surrounds it. And so this idea of making poetic kind of like these layered cavity wall systems that I spent my whole life growing up and constructing and being around kind of piqued my interest and sort of like developed the narrative from there. It felt like a natural fit.
Thank you. I guess it's just, I mean, I don't know the Toronto context, unfortunately, but just thinking of London and, you know, kind of the UK, that as, you know, obviously many cultures have had this kind of revival of craft in recent years, but also the notable return of brick building. But also, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about what you've touched on there, which is that not all brick is the same, that we think of when we think of yeah, you know, kind of wood, glass, whatever it is, that actually that there isn't actually in-depth investigation of what happens essentially when the market kind of, it's a market exploitation causing the degradation of the material itself, which is a really kind of worrying process, but also quite an interesting one. I mean, the extreme that I noticed you don't even deign to talk about in your thesis is when brick is basically wallpaper. So it's just,
Yeah,
you know, they fill it in with our Pret-a-Manger cafes or whatever, you know, that kind of industrial chic. But I noticed that was notably absent from your discussion.
yeah, I think it was sort of in some ways just kind of that to me. Maybe it's my own personal biases, but that isn't what I would define as brick masonry. That's like you said, a wallpaper. And I guess with that mindset, it just never led me to even approach the question. I was more focused on sort of the idea of the capacity of sort of more bespoke units and their ability to sort of expand the capabilities of the system. Like one of the things that pops into my head a lot is the idea that more traditional construction practices, I think even as much as like 20, 30 years ago, like, you know, standard subdivision housing in and around Toronto, you know, the quintessential bay window that exists at the front of those houses, there was a specific brick that was meant to turn those 45-degree corners like a bay window brick. And then you see more contemporary versions of that. And the bay window brick isn't produced anymore. And so you get like a line that just kind of like creates that corner. And so with that idea, it was, you know, you mentioned that it's a result of just certain markets deciding what product is available out there. And part of that investigation was, you know, kind of avoiding the typical sort of craft narrative of like being stubborn and saying, it's like, no, like I love this whole thing and that's the way I'm going to do it, in a way accommodating the context that's around us. And so that led to discussions with brick manufacturers in Toronto, specifically Brampton Brick, about the sort of like marketing and production processes and what it actually means to introduce those bespoke systems into sort of like a material catalog. And I learned a lot about how much it costs the company to produce anything than their standard units, how much it costs them to be forced to shut down the line. And so they'll do anything in order to prevent that. Specifically, if they can create a unit that's cut from standard units, they'll do that first, which is why the version of the modular system that I presented touches upon it, but I think the version that's presented in sort of the appendix of the thesis as well kind of goes further into depth about it. But the idea that like the modularity of the brick being 6 parts, it can be cut into a single module, a dual, a triple, 4, 5, and that act of cutting the brick allows like one to maintain a standard production rate to a certain degree. And so that's all these things were kind of done to you know, maintain certain production costs, B, reduce site waste, but then even the fact that the brick is a square initially takes like these certain bespoke shapes and doubles their use. So sort of like a chamfered brick can be used in elevation and in plan depending on the context. So all those like steps were taken to try and address like the reality of our markets and you know, the sort of infrastructure we built to produce these building materials and create a system that can begin to lend itself to sort of more craft and poetic and sort of culturally specific expressions of the material.
Thank you.
Garth, as second reader, would you like to bring anything up for discussion?
You know, I have said so much over the last while. I'm going to leave it to the guests to do most of the talking, seeing as they've come from afar. So that's what I'll say.
Okay, thank you. Carlo?
Well, after Garth says that, but I tend to agree with Garth. Gregor's heard a lot from me, but maybe one minor thing. You've mentioned the act of making, and this relates to some of the questions that have been posed already. And you talk about how design and workmanship are coming together in the diagram that's on the screen currently. So I'm just wondering about the act of making versus the act of designing, and how you see that process, and how that relationship actually is part of this diagram. And maybe you can speak to what you talked about in terms of the drawing itself becoming the thing itself. So it's how does that process actually look like?
I think first, it's kind of a tough question to answer with this diagram, because I think this diagram is kind of like lists more a series of specific events. But to kind of like address the second part, I think the drawing is sort of like it's a result of its evolution, and the fact that it's transitioning from merely representation into sort of a sort of encapsulation of knowledge of the thing itself, right? And granted, it's part of like this thesis was sort of, I wanted to touch on the technological side of things without making this a sort of thesis about, you know, craft and contemporary technology or something like that, but just kind of establish a specific sort of a narrative about craft in a contemporary context without it relying on sort of contemporary definitions of the tool. So I think it's like as architecture kind of starts to evolve, as we have like BIM systems or even like 3D models that are direct sort of methods of production for actual objects, they evolve that process of making. You have like the term with certain technologies is like rapid prototyping, right? It's kind of like a reflection of just testing your idea. Like you work the digital model, you hit print, and you come back a few hours later, study it, and then evolve it based on that. It's not an evolution of thought based on the design or the representation in front of you, but the physical object that the design produces at that point. And so I think like within my thesis, some of the kind of like the moments where that best occurs is after like the initial sort of raked zigzag corner detail, after all the sort of ridiculous work that came out of making those plaster bricks, and then finally, I think after constructing these stone models of the fire stations, as sort of like a larger, all-encompassing investigation of construction, as opposed to just the brick material. So I kind of think it's that transition from the idea to the development of the object, and then reevaluating my work based on the construction of those things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll turn it back to Catherine and Jennifer.
I can ask another question. So I really enjoyed reading your thesis document, and particularly like the first half where you were kind of setting up the theoretical framework. That was really well done. And I also couldn't help but think about my past experience at Brian McKay Lyon's office, and smiled a little when I got to that paragraph about his work.
I'll admit I wasn't able to learn too much about you guys. So when Marco mentioned that you used to work at Brian McKay Lyon's, I got a little nervous. But yeah, sorry.
I think it's good to have a conversation about it if you don't mind. But I think that people often write about the work as being, you know, well crafted in quotes, or like based on craft traditions. And I think, you know, what is talked about maybe behind closed doors is that craft for Brian and for the office is really a byproduct. It's not something that sought out in and of itself, but you know, the work is based on studying vernacular building traditions, you know, like the way a building is framed, for example. You know, the most efficient way to frame a building would lead to, you know, a window patterning that is kind of typical of the office. And so people look at the window patterning and see that as an aesthetic choice, but it's actually based on the kind of tradition of framing. And you know, the zero detail that, you know, I think people look at and mimic, it's like a well-crafted kind of thing, is actually based on, you know, in his mind, what is really suitable to an East Coast climate and replicating what farmers do in that area. You know, he talks about a lot about learning from farmers because, you know, they do what is most efficient because they can't afford to get it wrong. You know, and like the most recent book called Economy of Ethics. So I think that is actually the kind of most recent way of thinking about the work in his mind, that it's really about economy rather than craft. Like, or in my, we never really talked about craft as a thing, even though I know his lectures are sometimes called place craft and community. But craft is really a byproduct of other things, not something you kind of do consciously, and maybe different than you know, the diagram that you did of the brick and kind of analyzing the module and having the kind of unit form the aesthetic. So I guess my question is it still craft if it's a byproduct and like a result of these other things? And where does that fit in within the historical, you know, canon that you set up of craft?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Brian McKay Lyons was definitely someone that constantly came up, even though I didn't end up writing very much about him in my thesis. He was a sort of reappearing example that came up throughout my research. And to kind of answer your question, it's like, I think what I presented was not what I hope came across as not the idea of craft or like the one sort of framework, but my framework of it. And what I kind of like about McKay Lyons' approach is exactly what you said, how it's a byproduct. And the thing that I respect the most coming from a builder background is that his projects largely rely on sort of standard mass-produced materials. They're like, it's very, very humble and legible in that sense. And I think it is. I think it's just another avenue with which to achieve a sort of architectural craft by way, where it's I think kind of like, if we zoom out for a second, the processes are very similar. They're derivative of the construction process, where I think like my fire station sort of takes a lot more explicit approach and very deliberately makes poetic those joints. I see McKay Lyons' work as kind of taking like the pragmatics of construction and sort of you know, where the goal is that efficient construction, it's still derived from the same sort of sources of historical knowledge that are then developed and evolved into this sort of new architectural language that's also at the same time speaks to the place from which it came. So I think a lot of like the larger motifs still resonate. They're just we just kind of get there in different ways.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Since we started, we are a bit pressed for time, but I think we've had a pretty good discussion about the work. Thank you much, Greg. Are there any final that anyone would like before? Oh. So it's impossible to tell.
Can I ask a final question?
I'm afraid we're frozen. Yes.
Yes, so
please.
in and out there. I mean, there's so many things I'd love to talk to you about in more detail, but I guess one thing that I was really intrigued about was your methodology. and it's partly, I think, you don't give yourself credit for something, but I'm also intrigued, which is that you not only write about making to understand the subject, but you also do some making. And I wondered if there were any, that's very, to put it very glibly, I wonder if there are any particular insights that you know, particularly now that you've got all that body of literature behind you to talk about the importance of making as a way of knowing, with that language maybe now at your disposal, what does it mean for you to actually embark on that journey yourself?
In some way, I think you know, I never want to see bricks again in my life, but I mean, I think it sort of reaffirmed a lot of things I went into sort of my architectural education with to begin with, such that like that these construction processes directly kind of inform the way I think about architecture and building is like I think about the design of a building as the process of constructing it. So I think what these investigations kind of reaffirmed in a variety of different ways, whether it be like the laying of the bricks, the making of those bricks, which I think was probably the most unique experience I had in this one, like what it actually takes to like consider the size, shape, proportion, and then what the sort of consequences of those choices are in the hand and in laying those bricks. It kind of continues to inform my process of thought, like knowing what I know now, the kind of like these sort of long super long square bricks kind of still lend themselves to a relative kind of comfort in the hand and constructability, especially when in Toronto at least things like jumbo brick sizes are kind of starting to dominate the sort of brick market as you know, primary concerns become bricks per square foot and coverage in a certain amount of times and how many bricks you can lay a day. And that formula kind of is like becomes simple math where it's like if it's 1,000 bricks a day, okay, then make like a slightly, how big can we make the brick before that curve kind of peaks, right? And so that's what all those processes kind of derive as well. And I think this whole investigation just kind of like links me back closer to forced me, I should say, to consider a lot of the things that a lot of the lessons I learned growing up on construction sites in different ways through sort of an architectural lens. And I think that also lends itself to this craft narrative is forcing me to examine and reconsider these sort of biases I held true in one perspective through the lens of another. So.
Thank you.
Slowly losing Marco, I guess.
Yeah.
Marco, you're on mute. Marco, you're on mute.
Yeah.
You're either muted or frozen.
I think he's gone.
Okay, sorry about that. Frozen.
Yeah.
You guys keep freezing and unfreezing, so I'm assuming you're seeing the same from my end. So what I would like to do at this point is wrap up because we are going way over our time. Greg, I just want to thank you for your presentation and ask you if there's anything you would like to say.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
I
is there anything you'd like to add?
You don't feel. It's just.
Okay, I'm gonna assume all the voices are stopping now. I just want to say thank you. This has been a wonderful experience, especially from. Hey, no, that's not true. There were definitely hard times, but you know, the end is bittersweet, and I think the feedback from the committee was wonderful, and it was nice to talk about sort of the work holistically and everything that led to this point. So I just want to thank everybody for all the work that was done up to this point. So thank you.
Well done.
Thanks, Gregor.
Thank you, Gregor.
Greg, So we're gonna.
I think Marco keeps going in and out, so I'll just say that
how the committee can have.
we're gonna deliberate, and we're gonna ask you to leave, Gregor, and then I'll call you when this is all done, when the deliberation's done.
Sounds good. Thank you all again. Thank you for the
Thanks,
feedback.
Gregor.
Have a lovely day.